Hello, welcome back to Dinosaurs. We're going to talk about nesting and growth today. Originally, going to talk a little bit about social, but I think we'll save more of that for next time because it has a lot to do with their brain activity. So we'll talk more about that with the physiology and senses next class. And then we'll talk about ectothermy versus endothermy and whether or not they had feathers. And then we're done with module 2, and then we're going to start discussing individual kind of dinosaur groups. So hopefully everybody's still following along, getting ready for that midterm, and make sure you're trying to stay on track. So some announcements. Okay, so let's review on trace fossils. So we spent all last class talking about footprints and how shall we say leavings. So what can we learn from a dinosaur's footprint, a single footprint, or if we have multiple footprints, a trackway? What can we learn from that? So look at those options there. And what do you think? Hopefully you're having a little trouble narrowing it down because any of those last three, so body weight can be determined from looking at the tracks, especially a trackway. Body size and shape, again, you would probably need a series of tracks to do that. And then the style of walking, whether they were upright, bipedal, or whether they were quadrupedal on all fours. But there's a lot of information that we can get from footprints, and especially if there's multiple footprints, a lot of information about the animal itself from just the tracks. Just like if you're out in the wilderness and you see some modern animal tracks, there's a lot you can tell about that animal from those modern tracks. Here's an example of a discovery. So I think like this little child discovered this little dinosaur footprint. I don't actually see the dinosaur footprint on that block, but here's a zoom in. So let's just assume that it's there. Good job. The next slide. So what can we learn from dinosaur fossilized feces? So again, these things are called coprolites. Why would anyone want to study dinosaur poo? What can we learn from that? Again, kind of a trick question. We can learn a lot about diet, we can learn a lot about dentition, we can learn a lot about digestion. So the 3Ds, I guess. We can learn a lot about a dinosaur's lifestyle from what it leaves behind. I've got this red box here because, again, same thing with tracks. When you find a coprolite, you don't usually find it in association with the body fossil of that organism. And so it's sometimes difficult to pin down exactly what species of dinosaur this was, and definitely what individual dinosaur it was. It would be very fortunate to find the trace fossil along with the body fossil. And occasionally that happens with invertebrates. I'm not sure there's any examples with dinosaurs, but if you hear of any, please let me know, post up on the discussion board. But anyway, that's trace fossils. So let's talk about nesting. So we're going to talk about dinosaur nests, we're going to talk about dinosaur growth, and we're going to talk about a little bit about dinosaur society. But so this all kind of came about, there was always a debate about the role of dinosaurs as parents and whether they were kind of doting, attentive parents, or whether they just kind of left their eggs and went away like sea turtles do. So this was a kind of spectacular fossil here that was, again, the association of the body fossil of a dinosaur and eggs. I think I told the story already, but forgive me. This specimen was originally named Oviraptor philoceratops, which translates to, so Oviraptor is egg thief, ovi is egg, and raptor is thief. So like velociraptor is speedy thief or swift thief. But Oviraptor is egg thief, and philoceratops means lover of ceratops. So the original interpretation of this specimen was that this was a sneaky egg thief coming into a ceratopsian nest and stealing the eggs or eating the eggs in place there. It was attacking the nest. It was predating on the nest. Later on, it was discovered, obviously this is a recreation, not the actual specimen, but inside these eggs that were allegedly ceratopsian eggs were little mini oviraptors. And so as opposed to stealing these eggs and trying to eat these eggs, it was actually protecting these eggs. And you can actually see here with the limbs, the front limbs kind of stretched out with these nasty claws. You can see a recreation of life pictured with feathers here. Obviously, there's no feathers preserved on this specimen, but it's nesting, it's brooding over the eggs in a very similar fashion to modern birds. If this was a cold-blooded animal without any insulation, it wouldn't really do a whole lot of good to keep your body mass over the nest. So this is, again, sort of indicators that it might have had feathers for insulating the nest like modern birds do. It might have been warm-blooded. Again, we'll talk about that controversy next week. But very clearly, this particular species, this particular individual, was brooding over the nest and insulating the nest and taking a very active role in the development of its eggs and making sure that those eggs survived long enough to hatch. And you'll notice also the number of eggs here. We'll talk about how many eggs dinosaurs laid a bit later on, but this was a little bit kind of surprising because, again, if we think about like modern lizards, this isn't something that we kind of expect to see. And so they're actually, in a lot of cases, behaving more similarly to birds, which now, with the recognition that birds are a surviving lineage of the dinosaurs, maybe that's not quite so surprising anymore. But it was a little bit of a revelation at the time. So let's take a look at some fossil nests. So these are actual specimens of actual fossilized dinosaur nests. Intact, entire nests are pretty rare, but they're very valuable for giving us insight into the parenting style of dinosaurs. Just from looking at the arrangements of the nests, how many eggs there are, how they're oriented, can tell us a lot about how the dinosaurs were parenting. And so one thing that becomes pretty obvious right away is that the eggs were often carefully arranged. So in this case, you can see that they're in a ring, and here as well, the dinosaur that was sitting over this nest was taking a very active role in moving these things around. Maybe they rotated them like some modern animals do, but they've definitely made like a pattern here. Notice the big gap in the middle here. That's for the body weight of the big dinosaur to sit in the middle without crushing the eggs. So you can see the ring of eggs along the outside, probably using perhaps feathered limbs to insulate. But you can kind of see that in this case, the eggs have actually worn away, and you can see the skeleton of the embryos still inside there. And so you can actually kind of ID these. One thing that's unfortunate is that there's a lot of dinosaur egg forgeries that are available for sale. So if you go to like eBay or even just any kind of fossil shop, dinosaur eggs are a very common thing that you'll see for sale. There are a lot of fakes out there. This one in particular is especially egregious. Sure, it has the general shape of an egg, but if you know anything about rocks, which hopefully you do from earth science or earlier on in this course, this is a metamorphic rock. It's not a sedimentary rock. It's not a fossil. This is polished, maybe glacially polished, maybe beach polished, maybe man-made polished. It's a polished metamorphic rock. It's not a dinosaur egg. There's no way that this is dinosaur egg. Now, certain concretions that occur naturally can become kind of spherical shaped. I'm sure you've all seen rocks along the beach that are kind of vaguely egg shaped. Sometimes it can be very hard to tell. Again, context is very important. Eggs are usually found in association with other dinosaur material, not just randomly on a beach all by themselves in isolation. You can also see how the shell is relatively thin, like you would expect from an eggshell. You often kind of see evidence of little pore spaces there. Obviously, they'll have the embryos inside if you're able to CAT scan or something like that to see inside. But just taking like sandstone and kind of sculpting a general egg shape on there, or maybe like taking rocks and kind of pasting them together into this nest-like shape, it's a very common scam on paleontology websites. I'm part of a fossil identification forum, and unfortunately, there's a lot of people that post on there about fossils that they've bought and they're very happy to have, and they spent a lot of money on, and then only for people to tell them that it's almost certainly a fake, and obviously they get a little upset about that. So if you're in the market for dinosaur eggs, be very careful. They're very commonly faked. So how do we get any insights whatsoever into dinosaur nesting behavior or their parenting behavior? What can we study to try to do that? Well, we saw that occasionally we'll stumble upon dinosaur nests. We see the preserved remains, but we're trying to reconstruct like what dinosaur eggs, what dinosaur nests looked like when they were still like in their living form at the time. And so all we have left are the hard parts of the dinosaur, if we're lucky, the eggs, if we're lucky, maybe occasionally the structure of the nest, what it was made out of. But these are kind of few and far between, and we don't have it available for every single dinosaur species. And so we have to make kind of inferences. So one way that we make inferences about long extinct organisms like dinosaurs is this concept of phylogenetic bracketing. So we mentioned this concept earlier in the course. Phylogeny, we talked about when we were talking about cladistics, those trees, like this one, for example, those evolutionary trees. Phylogeny is this evolutionary relationship, the evolutionary ancestry of these organisms. And phylogenetic bracketing is taking an organism that's more basal, more quote unquote primitive. Again, primitive just means earlier forms, not necessarily primitive in the sense that we think of it like more like basic, basically. And then there's the more like derived forms, again, just because they're farther up the tree doesn't mean they're more like advanced or better. They're just later on in that evolutionary lineage. Crocodiles do the crocodile job just as well as birds do the bird job. There's no more advanced than the other. They both fill their roles well, just as dinosaurs did. But if we take a crocodilian who branched off from the dinosaur lineage very early on in their evolutionary history, and we take birds that branched off from dinosaurs very late in their evolutionary history, dinosaurs fall in between. And so if there are features that are present in the more basal form and the more derived form, it's very likely they were present in the forms between. So any trait that crocodilians and birds have in common, very likely everything in between had those traits as well. Now that's not always true, but it's a good start point. So if you're present in the early form and the later form, it's probably present in your immediate forms. But as we know, the branches kind of go off their own directions and evolve separately. So it's not always true, but it's a good guess. It's a good start point when you have no other information. So if we want to decide what dinosaur nests looked like and how dinosaurs behaved on those nests or near those nests, we can look at modern crocodiles. So modern crocodiles, alligators, crocodilians, they build their nests mostly out of vegetation, and they tend to bury the eggs in the mess of vegetation. Some cases they'll use dirt, but they bury the eggs because they're cold-blooded, and so if they were to brood on the eggs, it wouldn't be very effective. And so they use other material to insulate the eggs and bury the eggs and protect the eggs. Whereas birds tend to have more open nests because they don't use, I mean, in some cases they'll use vegetation and in some cases guano, feces, and feathers to construct a nest, but they don't cover it with that vegetation. It's an open nest on top. Why? Because the bird goes on top. The bird, it's warm-blooded metabolism, high metabolism. They use their body heat to insulate. They use their wings to insulate. They use their feathers to insulate. They insulate the eggs as opposed to using vegetation. So these are behaviors that we see in the bracketing, older and more derived forms. And so this is probably what dinosaurs did, or very similar to this. So again, from phylogeny, that evolutionary relationship, and occasional scattered fossils, we're able to kind of make some inferences, some strong guesses about dinosaur nesting habits, even though we're not able to actually see dinosaurs actively tending nests. We don't have the luxury of a time machine. All we have are the preserved hard parts of the organism, the trace fossils. If we're lucky, we get traces of the nests and the eggs. But if we look at, these are some reconstructions of what dinosaur nesting behavior might have looked like. So the nests were on the ground. So today, when you think about a nest, it very often conjures a picture of a bird nest. And when you think of a bird nest, you usually think of like up in a tree. Now, obviously not all birds nest in trees. There's a lot of ground nesting birds. There's a lot of cliff nesting birds. There's a lot of birds that don't make their nests in trees. But that's kind of what we think about. Dinosaurs did not make their nests in trees, at least as far as we know. Maybe some of the smaller species possibly did, but probably not. But as far as we know, we don't have any evidence of that. So they were probably on the ground, almost certainly on the ground, often with some vegetation incorporated. And so now the big question is, were the nests kind of more like crocodile nests, where they were covered over entirely using the vegetation and the dirt as insulation, or were they open, kind of more like birds? So like here we have an open nest, and this dinosaur, this Oviraptor here, is actively tending, actively brooding on that nest. It's an open style nest. If the dinosaur is not present, those eggs are open to the elements, and so they need to actively maintain that. Whereas this larger Hadrosaur here, the quote unquote duck-billed dinosaur, it's got a big mound here of vegetation, and maybe it's covered over. You can also look at structures of the eggs themselves. So you can look at whether the eggs are porous or not, and that tells you about whether they may have been buried or not. And so there's a couple different lines of evidence that we can do. But what we see is that it's not either or. There are certain dinosaur species that favored the kind of buried or closed nests, and there's some that were more open. And so like nests, dinosaurs that made nests that were more similar to bird nests are generally the ones that are more closely related to birds. They probably have feathers for insulating the nests and closing it in, whereas the larger dinosaurs, or the ones that are a little bit more basal, they probably behaved a little bit more like crocodiles. If a hadrosaur, a very large herbivore, tried to sit on the nest to brood it, it would be a very unfortunate situation. It wouldn't be productive. And so they developed a strategy where they don't brood with their body. They insulate it in vegetation and ground cover. And again, these aren't like hard and fast rules, but in general, the larger dinosaur species had like these closed nests, and the later, more bird-like dinosaurs had the open nests. So what kind of eggs did dinosaurs lay? So again, using this phylogenetic bracketing, if we look at what crocodile eggs look like, so here's a little baby alligator, a crocodilian, hatching out of the egg. You notice that the egg is brittle, hard calcium shell. Sometimes they have this little notch on their nose here for getting through the egg. You see the little bird has that on their beak as well. This little chick here has made its way out through the egg. Again, you see how brittle and kind of crunchy these eggs are. If you've ever made scrambled eggs or any kind of eggs, if you're making an omelet, you have to crack eggs. You know that eggshells are hard, and that's what we think about when we think of bird eggs. And it's also true of crocodile eggs. So if we're using phylogenetic bracketing, the earlier, more basal crocodiles have hard calcareous eggs. The more derived, quote unquote, advanced birds have calcareous hard eggs. Dinosaurs are in between, so they must have hard calcareous eggshells as well. And for the most part, that's what we see. However, some caveats here is that pterosaurs, the flying reptiles, remember they're not dinosaurs because of the different structures, they have leathery eggs. And so this is an example of a pterosaur egg. You see the surface of the egg is kind of squished in without breaking. And so they have these kind of papery, leathery, parchment style eggs. And we see that as well in modern lizards and in some turtles. So there was kind of this thought that, you know, okay, well, pterosaurs are their own branch. They derived that later. They evolved to that more primitive form, the parchment eggs, but dinosaurs are still in between there. And they probably had these hard shells too. However, one thing that was always bothering paleontologists is that we do have nests and eggs from a lot of the different dinosaur clades, but ceratopsian eggs were very few and far between. So why are we able to find lots of theropod eggs? Why are we finding sauropod eggs? Why are we not finding ceratopsian eggs? So like Triceratops, the ceratopsian, the frilled with the horns. So eventually there were samples of protoceratops eggs that were found, kind of a basal ceratopsian. They were shown to have this parchment style egg. And so the reason that we find very few ceratopsian eggs is that it's probably likely that ceratopsians had these parchment style eggs that wouldn't preserve as well. They're much less likely to show up in the fossil record. Obviously not impossible, because this pterosaur egg fossilized just fine, but it's a lot more likely to find pieces and fragments and maybe even whole eggs of these hard shells than it is these much more delicate papery parchment eggs. So what kind of eggs? The answer is, unfortunately, it depends. So, but for the most part, dinosaurs generally have the hard calcareous eggs, as do crocodiles and birds. So how many eggs do they lay? Again, the answer is it depends, but we'll get to that in a second. So one thing that's interesting is that the number of eggs, or the number of live young, depending on the animal species, how many offspring an organism has, provides some information, in some cases a lot of information, on the lifestyle and the parenting strategies. So there's kind of two ends of a spectrum here. There's R-selected organisms where their numbers are governed by their maximum reproductive capacity. That's what R stands for. So the numbers of these organisms that are present is controlled by basically how quickly and how much they can reproduce. And so they produce a lot of offspring. So like an oyster, this is, I think, for a year, an oyster would produce 500 million offspring. But there's very little care for the individual offspring. There's a very low survival rate. And so most of them don't make it. So that's why they make so many. It's very unlikely that any one individual will survive. If they do survive, however, they grow very rapidly to sexual maturity, and then they start making numerous offspring for which they don't provide a lot of care for, which also in turn has a low survival rate. And they also grow fast, mature quickly, and then they also tend to die fairly quickly. They have shorter lifespans in general. This is not always hard and fast rule, but this is kind of rules of thumb here. Then there's the K-selected, which the other end of the spectrum, which is kind of like where we would fall, where most mammals would kind of fall. Fewer offspring, but active parental care. So they produce fewer offspring, but they devote a lot more energy to ensuring that those few offspring survive. And so because of that, they have a higher survival rate. Someone's actively looking out for the young, actively tending to the young. And so they have the luxury of being able to grow slowly, and they can reach maturity slower, and their bodies can change over time a little bit slower. And that gives them a longer lifespan. And so again, it's not an either or here. It's a spectrum. And so there's like extremely R-type to extremely K-type. Again, this is an example of an R-type organism, a frog. Think about any frog eggs you've ever seen. You'll often see them not associated with a frog. The frog lays the eggs and it's gone. You'll find just this huge mess of frog eggs floating there. They produced a lot of offspring, knowing that they're not going to care for these individual offspring. And so of this pile of eggs here, not many of them are ever going to become frogs. Somewhere along the life cycle, generally very early in the life cycle, they're not going to make it. They're going to be predated, they're going to dry up, something's going to happen to them. Those that do survive, though, grow quickly and also, unfortunately, die quickly. K-selected is something more like these bald eagle here. You see they only have 2 eggs in this nest. They can have more, they can also have less, but you see they've got 2 eggs here. And you also notice that the eagle is in the picture with the eggs. It's not, eagles will occasionally leave the nest, so it's not like they're always there, but this eagle is insulating these eggs. It's caring for these eggs. It's protecting these eggs. It's devoting a lot of its energy to making sure that these few offspring make it to adulthood, and therefore they have a much higher rate of survival. Again, same thing with a lot of mammals. Mammals kind of look after their young in general, much higher survival rate, slower growth rate, and that's why. So where do dinosaurs fall within this spectrum? So most dinosaurs are kind of a little bit more towards the R side of the spectrum. Dinosaur nests average about 12-ish eggs. You can see that this is, I didn't count these, but it looks like about 12. 1, 2, 3, yeah, I think it is exactly 12. This nest is a little bit more though, but in general, that's kind of about the amount there. It's not a handful of eggs, and it's not hundreds of eggs. It's on the order of a dozen or so, maybe 2 dozen. And this is kind of true regardless of the body size, which is kind of interesting. So they kind of fall in this range where they lay more eggs than birds do, but they lay less eggs than turtles do, and certainly way less eggs than frogs do. And that kind of gives you a sense of kind of how actively involved they are. They're a little bit more involved than turtles, and they're less involved than birds. And again, this varies from species to species. There's at least some evidence of parental care, like birds. Crocodiles also, to some extent, take care of their offspring. In some cases, like there are some evidence in the captivity of active feeding of the young, but generally they're just kind of like guiding them along. So just by looking at the size of the brood, how many individuals there are, gives you some insight into how well or how much energy they're devoting to their young. So you see here on this artist's rendition here, they took the time to build a nest. They are in the general vicinity, but they're not actively sitting on nests. And these nests would probably actually be covered over because nobody's actively sitting on them, but you kind of get the hint here. So how dependent on their parents were dinosaurs? So when a fresh dinosaur is hatched, what were they like? So what were they capable of doing? Obviously, we don't have any way of directly looking at hatched dinosaurs. So again, one of the ways we know things about the past, the present is the key to the past. Let's look at living organisms. What kind of styles of, what are newborn animals capable of in the wild? So you see that there's a very wide range. So there's precocial or precocial, maybe. I've never heard it said, sorry. So that means, so they're well developed and they're mobile already at birth. So elephants here, this is a brand new, just born baby elephant. You can see that it still has the umbilical cord here. It still has some of the afterbirth on it. This is a brand new newborn elephant. And you see that it's already standing. It's already standing. Very soon it'll be walking. Deer, basically the fawn is born. The mother kind of maybe gets up and walks away. The fawn's already follows her. The fawns are ready to go. Same thing with like giraffes. Giraffes are these massive animals. As soon as the baby comes out, they're mobile. Now, they're not as coordinated as the adults. Elephants, it takes some time for them to learn how to walk properly. It takes a little bit longer time for them to get full control over their trunks and be able to manipulate things well, but they're ready to move around. Bear cubs are very much not. So bear cubs are born in the den and you see the eyes are not even open here yet. The mother is going to stay in the den with the newborn cubs and nurse them on the milk like most mammals do. Very slow growth, and they're not ready for the world on their own immediately. We see this trend in birds as well. Some birds hatch out and they're ready to go. So like chickens, this chick is like, hey, what's up? Let's do this thing. They're, as soon as they hatch, they're peep, peep, peep and running around. This time of year, a lot of tractor supply companies have like shipments of chicks in. They're very cute and cool. So if you have the opportunity, go check it out. But like robins and other birds, their chicks are very much not ready to function on their own. And you see the nest here, they're not even entirely covered in feathers. Their eyes are not open, they're not fully developed. And they're entirely reliant on their parents to come bring them food. If that doesn't happen, they're going to die. This chick is capable, at least to some degree, of foraging on its own right away. It's ready to roll. And so there's a varying degree in modern animals of how dependent on the parents newborns are. So what were dinosaurs? So the capabilities of dinosaur hatchlings, again, it depends. So this is the answer to a lot of these questions, unfortunately. Remember that dinosaurs lived for a very long time. They lived from 252 million years to 66 million years. And there's 5 big clades of the dinosaurs that we're going to talk about. And you've already seen all the variety of shapes and sizes, habitats, lifestyles, family structure, social structure, all these differences. So it's very, when you start asking questions about dinosaurs as a homogeneous group, it's kind of like asking questions about all reptiles as a homogeneous group or all mammals as a homogeneous group. It's going to vary from species to species, but it seems to at least kind of roughly depend and is at least maybe related to the egg number. So like in general, the lower the amount of eggs that they have, that probably means they're devoting more energy and attention to making sure that those eggs survive. There's less eggs in the basket, I guess. So like, for example, Hadrosaur hatchlings, they have very poorly developed joints when they're born. Again, we see this from fossil embryos and fossil newborns, which again is a very fortuitous discovery. They don't have the means to get around on their own, but they show wear on their teeth, which means that they're feeding. So if you can't move around, but you're still eating, how are you getting that food? Well, it was probably the parent that was bringing it. They were actively being taken care of. And so hadrosaurs probably had a fairly active parenting style, whereas other dinosaurs that would have like larger broods, maybe their young were much more likely to be fully formed. And that's what we see, is that their embryos are much more well developed. The hatchlings are ready to roll around immediately. They're ready to move and feed on their own. This little guy here is ready to go start capturing little small prey on its own. And eventually it's going to grow up to the larger size and start taking on even bigger and bigger prey. But they're ready for life immediately. And so it really depends. What were dinosaur hatchlings like? What dinosaur are we talking about? So again, if you look at the number of eggs, it gives you some insights into that. Another thing that's pretty unique about dinosaurs is that, so all dinosaurs come from eggs. As far as we know, no dinosaurs gave live birth. Now, ichthyosaurs, plesiosaurs, they did have live birth. So it's not impossible that some did, but it's fairly unlikely. Again, if we use phylogenetic bracketing, the birds lay eggs, crocodiles, alligators lay eggs, dinosaurs laid eggs. There may be some exceptions. I'm not sure how we would ever know that, because again, lack of evidence is not evidence. If we don't have eggs from a certain species, that doesn't mean they didn't exist. It means we haven't found them yet, or potentially it means we haven't found them yet. But the thing that's interesting is that even the largest dinosaurs, so remember, these are the largest land animals ever on the face of the earth. So like these massive sauropods in the background here, the babies are pretty small. So every single dinosaur that you can think of, from the tall and the small, they all hatch from eggs that are no larger than a basketball. There's a couple websites circulating out there with like large dinosaur eggs. Those are misinterpreted. So again, there's naturally occurring things like concretions, which are these, they can be like up to like bowling ball in bigger size. Sometimes they get mistaken for turtle shells because they often have external markings like that. They form naturally in sediments as the sediment kind of makes these concentric layers, like a everlasting gobstopper sort of. It's pretty easy to tell them apart because their surfaces kind of flake off, and you see these concentric circles inside. Eggs only have that on the very outer layer. You don't see multiple layers like that. But dinosaur eggs, even so, like we might have this misconception that like big dinosaurs had big eggs. It's not. This is not a thing that happened. There's nothing that would lay an egg this size. It's not like physically possible. It's not. The surface area is too high. I should say too low relative to the mass. It's not a feature that can exist. So this is like an artist's interpretation of something that never existed here. What we see is that the offspring of large modern mammals are already large. So again, like an elephant, a baby elephant is already pretty big. Baby giraffe is already pretty big. This is a relatively newborn young giraffe. And you see that it's already a pretty good portion of the size of the full-grown adult. It still has a lot of growing to do, and it's still not fully mobile. It's still awkward and gangly, but it's pretty much ready to go. And it's fairly large, uncomfortably large, probably for the mother, and it's an awful long drop. Dinosaur young are born really small, and they grow very quickly. And so this makes kind of this weird occurrence that we see in dinosaurs, at least in the carnivorous dinosaurs, where maybe the developing dinosaurs fill different niches. We'll talk about that in a second. But so this is a human for scale. This is the size of a newborn hatched sauropod dinosaur that's eventually going to become the largest land animal ever on Earth. You see the scale of the femur. So this is just the upper leg bone of the adult. You see that it's as tall as this person is. It's as wide as this person is. This is a massive dinosaur. Some got larger than this even. One thing you see though, so the yellow, the green, and the blue, this is like newborn, maybe like hatchling, and then maybe like a juvenile versus adult. These are all the outlines superimposed on here. You see the ratios maintain, the width versus length maintains, it doesn't change. The shape doesn't really change. And so in a lot of ways, baby dinosaurs are just miniature versions of the big dinosaurs, and they grow very quickly because they don't have the luxury of coming out already pretty large. They have to play catch up. And so dinosaur growth is very interesting. So the dinosaur growth rate from a really small hatchling, again, a really small hatchling, to a full-sized adult is sort of like, it's insanely fast. It's abnormally fast. Compared to modern animals, it's probably unprecedentedly fast. There may be other examples of organisms that are close, but I'm not really familiar with any. So again, most dinosaurs seem to start out as miniature versions of the adult, and then they very rapidly grow. So this adult version here, you can see that the juvenile version and the hatchling version, the ratios are pretty consistent. The limb lengths are pretty much the same. The gait changes a little bit, so kind of more upright, more bipedal, but the ratios look very much the same. These dinosaurs are very obviously the same species, just different sizes, and they very quickly, so this is the growth here, you see it's a very steep curve, and then it kind of starts flattening out. So this dinosaur reaches full maturity around like 7-ish years or so. Whereas for a human and other mammals, it can take a lot longer than that, 2 to 3 times that. Another thing that we see is that as mammals grow, especially particularly humans grow, a newborn baby and a full-grown adult have very different proportions. The ratios of the femur, that length and width that we showed on the last slide, which is basically identical throughout the growth phase of dinosaurs, it changes radically in humans as they grow. You see the ratio of the head to the rest of the body changes radically. The ratio of the limbs to the rest of the body changes radically. Human babies and human adults have very different shapes and very different proportions. It's what kind of makes this graph, frankly, sort of horrifying. Imagine like an adult-sized baby. It's a little bit weird. But anyway, dinosaurs didn't do this. Dinosaurs just kind of grew in the same proportions, and they grew very quickly. So that creates, at least potentially, this kind of weird situation. If we look at modern carnivores, so like if you go visit the African savanna, the modern African savanna, there's a whole wide spectrum of different carnivores that are preying on different organisms. So modern carnivores are over a whole size spectrum. They're hunting different things. Small organisms like mongoose are hunting, or mongooses are hunting smaller things. They might be insectivores or hunting smaller rodents. You go up the size a little bit and you have kind of the wild dogs. They're hunting organisms that are a little bit bigger, filling in kind of these middle niches, the middle tier here. And then at the peak of the food chain, the apex predator, you have the big cats, like say lions. So there's like this whole spectrum of body sizes is covered. In dinosaurs, we don't see that, and there's been a lot of speculation as to why. The carnivorous dinosaurs, especially herbivores, do sort of cover the whole spectrum, but carnivorous dinosaurs are kind of this bimodal distribution where there is very small species of carnivorous dinosaurs that are probably like insectivores, feeding on small mammals. And then there's the massive apex predators that are almost exclusively feeding on other dinosaurs, which are the only other large animals around, or mostly the only other large animals around. And then there's nothing in between. That's if we look at the adult final size. In the course of a Tyrannosaurus rex, for example, becoming a full-grown Tyrannosaurus rex, it spends a lot of its time, or well, it's a fast time, but a decade or so, it's filling this middle role. Juvenile teenage T-Rexes are filling a very different role. And so in the fossil record, where we already said the story about the Nanotyrannus was originally identified as a different species, it's actually almost certainly just a juvenile Tyrannosaurus rex. And from looking at the teeth, looking at the chemistry, looking at its diet, coprolites, it was eating different things than the adults were. And so because dinosaurs grow so quickly, the teenage dinosaurs that are in this kind of size range, they outcompete all the other dinosaurs that would be trying to fill these roles. It's not that there are no mid-sized carnivores, it's that those roles are filled by the growing large carnivores. And so there's no room for other animals in that. A Nanotyrannus is going to outcompete anything that kind of fills this space. It's just better at doing that job. And so there's this weird kind of bimodal distribution where you have really small carnivores, really big carnivores, and apparently nothing in between, because the medium animals eventually go on to become the large animals. And so again, dinosaurs grow really, really quickly. So how do we know that? Well, like many animals around, their bones show these lines of arrested growth, or legs. And you can see this here. So here's some bone. You can see the open kind of porous structure. And then there's a line that goes all the way across. It grows in a circle in the cross section of the bone. Then there's more bone material added, a quote unquote growth spurt. That growth stops. And there's another line of arrested growth, a line where growth stopped for a little while, another growth spurt, another line of arrested growth. And so it ends up producing these patterns that are really similar to growth rings in trees. And so if we look at the cross-section of a dinosaur bone, we can actually calculate the dinosaur's size versus their age. And so this is the growth curve of a Tyrannosaurus. So by looking at the cross-section of Tyrannosaurus bones and looking at these legs and measuring them, you can see that they start out really small. It's a human for scale here. Baby tyrannosaurs are smaller, much smaller than humans. They're like, initially, again, they're smaller than a basketball. Then they kind of grow pretty quickly to like dog sized. Very soon, they're pretty similar to human size. And then by the time they're about 10 years old, they'd certainly be capable of eating humans. And then by the time they're like 17 to 20-ish, they're basically full size. Some of the smaller dinosaurs mature a little bit faster, but if you look at the growth rate versus body mass of a lot of modern animals, you see a relatively, the absolute values of these curves change, so they shift up and down, but the slopes are very similar. The curve for dinosaurs cuts across all those slopes, which means that dinosaurs grew at an incredibly fast rate, an abnormally fast rate, because they had to get from the small hatchling size up to the full adult size quickly because they have a relatively short lifespan. So how do we know that? Again, a lot of modern organisms that have the characteristics that dinosaurs have, the many offspring, dozen-ish eggs, rapid growth to maturity, they tend to have shorter lifespans. So like modern elephants, giraffes, larger mammals, tend to live pretty long. Elephants are recorded to have lived 70 plus years. In captivity, they can last a little bit longer even. The oldest documented crocodile was 140 years old, so that's tremendously old. There's evidence of even older creatures than that. But from the entire fossil record, the oldest known sauropod is only 38 years old. The oldest known T-Rex is only 33 years old-ish. Now, we probably don't have the fossil specimen of the oldest T-Rex that ever existed, just like we've probably never seen the actual oldest elephant that ever existed either. But of all the samples that we have, these are the oldest. And so dinosaurs probably didn't live 40, 50, 60 years. They kind of had this live fast, die young, leave a beautiful corpse philosophy. We can see on this chart here how long a lot of animals live. You see there's kind of this general trend, like larger body sizes live longer. That's not the trend that we see in dinosaurs. Dinosaurs kind of fall in this-ish range. What you'll notice is that there happens to be a lot of birds around in that range. What a coincidence. Dinosaurs ancestral to birds. So pretty interesting. And again, we can talk about families of dinosaurs. We mentioned this a little bit last time with the footprints. So the dinosaur species that were maybe more actively involved, that had lower numbers of offspring, they probably did travel in herds together, have some form of society. Here's again hadrosaurs, evidence that the herd of hadrosaurs covered the whole gambit of life cycle from the small hatchlings all the way up to the full adults. Lots of different trackways, very often found in bone beds of a lot of different individuals. The herbivorous dinosaurs almost certainly formed herds like this. Then the other question is always like, did the carnivorous organisms hunt in packs, as was kind of illustrated in Jurassic Park with the velociraptors? And the answer to this is probably no. So some may have, but like again, velociraptors, it appears that the young velociraptor hatchlings and the older mature velociraptors are eating different things, which means that the adults are not feeding the young. The young are kind of left on their own devices, which means that there's not that strong parental support network. There's not that like social hierarchy, or probably not anyways. But we sometimes see multiple individuals in the bone beds. Deinonychus was probably, at least to some degree, a pack animal. There's some isolated evidence, even in T-Rexes, of them traveling together. But again, traveling together and working together to hunt are two very different things. We'll talk about brain capacity, maybe even like communication next time when we talk about senses of dinosaurs, but they, in many cases, they probably weren't capable of advanced levels of coordination like this, but birds are very smart, and dinosaurs are related to birds, but they don't really have the same kind of cranial capacity, and so they probably weren't capable of that, but never say never. More evidence, we might come to different conclusions. So that's all I've got for today. Hope you enjoyed that, and goodbye.